What's up, folks? This is Justin from Books, Bricks, and Boards. Today, I'm going to talk to you about AD&D 2nd Edition, the game I spent 10 years playing as a kid. Now, you may have heard some negative things about this game, but I'm here to tell you, forget what you've heard, because that game was great, and I'm going to tell you why today. If you like rolling dice, slaying dragons, and blowing the dust off those old games of yore,
that's just my game.
while also appreciating the best of what new RPGs have to offer, you're in the right place. If you enjoy what you see, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. It seems that 70% of you that watch my videos are actually not subscribers.
I won't believe it. I can't believe it.
If you're looking for a place to have friendly discussions about your favorite games or fantasy literature, check out the Discord channel, where you'll find the best gamers this side of Lake Geneva.
I think they're talking about us.
Lastly, if you want to provide financial support for what I do here, consider a channel membership, starting as low as $2 a month. With all that out of the way, on with the show. The history of AD&D 2nd Edition. To say that Dungeons & Dragons was a child with many fathers would be a huge understatement. Of course, we all know of the co-creators, Ernest Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, but they had their own influences as well in their decades amongst the wargaming hobbyists, as well as the champions of fiction that lit their creative fires, the likes of Leiber, Howard, Smith, Tolkien, Moorcock, and others. Of course, along the way, many other designers contributed in meaningful ways to the development of the game. Mike Carr, Jeff Perrin, Steve Winter, Tim Kask, Rob Kuntz, John Eric Holmes, Tom Moldvay, Zeb Cook, and the immortal Frank Minster among the early contributors. Artists ranging from Errol Otis, Jeff Easley, and Larry Elmore, all the way to the high school kids from the Lake Geneva area that contributed to the earliest manuscripts. With so many prominent influences prior to the launch of AD&D 2nd Edition, you won't be surprised that 2nd Edition was actually the 6th different distinct version of the game, with the White Box, Holmes Basic, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Moldvay Cook Basic, and Mincer Basic, all preceding what we lovingly call 2nd Edition. It was during one of these earlier versions that the lead designer of 2nd Edition cut his teeth, as David Zeb Cook was the cook of Moldvay Cook Basic, having penned the expert set there. To say that 2nd Edition was a long time coming is very accurate, with Gygax having mentioned the idea as early as an issue of Dragon magazine prior to his 1985 ouster. That said, Gygax's early visions of the 2nd edition of the game was a consolidation of rules, fixing of known errors, and adding several new classes, while presumably keeping the additional classes added in Gygax's wildly successful Unearthed Arcana. What Cook's team, which started work in 1987, did was something very different. The majority of the 2E changes in the core books were of a clerical nature, improving clarity and organization, while also adding beautiful full-cover art by some of the best in the industry. There was also a distinct tonal change, with a focus on heroic actions by players and less discussion of the exploration of moral gray areas. Removed were the monk, assassin, barbarian, cavalier, acrobat, half-orc, and psionics, which by this time were all common at AD&D tables, replaced with a focus on the core concepts of the game and teaching that content in a more concise manner. Gone was the high Gygaxian prose, and in its place was a more restrained, even if only slightly by modern standards, approach to the language. It should be noted that every removed item listed above would find itself back in the game in some form over the releases found in the Complete Handbook series. Another change which met some pushback was the removal of devils and demons, though in reality they were merely renamed as Betazu and Tanari. But even they made a full return before the end of the edition. From 1989 until 3rd edition released in 2000, AD&D 2nd edition was D&D. And during that 11-year run, it captured the minds of countless gamers via its impressively voluminous catalog of releases. It is for that reason that I have seen fit to provide my own list of 10 great things about AD&D 2nd edition. In no particular order, this is my number one entry in the list, and that is the best monster manual. Complete, detailed, and beautiful. Now, this was not the first monster book released for 2nd edition AD&D, as there was a monstrous compendium binder that had loose leaf pages which would rip and get lost and was just very impractical to travel along with a kid taking to another person's house. But once they got their act together and released this and later the reprint with this, they had something good going. This includes not just the first Monster Manual compendium, but also much of the second and bits of other appendices as well. The art, mostly done by Dieter Lisi, if I recall correctly, was spot on. The entries were detailed. You got lots of ecology for each of the monsters, as well as all of the stats that you needed to use them at your table. Beyond that, you also had some entries which included statistics for using them amongst the player characters, most notably the Half Ogre. But throughout this entire tome, you will get the same high quality, very detailed, very well thought out entries that are not found in most of the prior or subsequent Dungeons and Dragons monster manuals. So this, the Monstrous Manual, is by far my favorite of the monster books released by TSR. So great, I actually own 3 copies of this, with the third being a print on demand, which you can still get on DriveThruRPG for around 20 bucks. So if you think that this is a game you can't afford to play, you are sorely mistaken, because all the core books you can get for reasonable prices, either as PDFs or print-on-demand copies. Number 2, weapon styles and combat options. Now, if you've at least got some knowledge of 2nd edition AD&D, you are somewhat familiar with the Brown books. These are the complete handbook series. All of them add something to the game, many of them add much to the game, but one I consider completely indispensable if you are going to play 2nd edition AD&D, and that is the Complete Fighter's Handbook. The reason being, it introduces weapon styles and combat options not found in the core rulebook, which add depth to the melee combat scenarios. In this book, you are able to specialize in sword and shield style, or two-handed weapon style, or two-weapon style, or single weapon style. It gives unarmed combat choices as well, and when you get into the combat options, you'll get such things as stapling. That's where you see in the movies an archer will shoot a person's shirt sleeve and pin them to a wall. You can do that in here. It has a more detailed version of disarming and also parrying. There's a lot in this book, and it's not just for fighters. The kits in here are specifically listed as being applicable to all of the warrior classes. So this book is indispensable mainly because of the weapon styles and combat options that it adds to the game, giving depth and flavor to the combat process. No, don't adjust your screens, because number 3 also involves these Brown books, and these all added kits to the game. Technically, these were not the first place that kits existed, as the Time of the Dragon box set for Dragonlance had kits before these were released. That said, these books perfected the kits and made them almost synonymous with 2nd edition AD&D. It is true, Some of them may be a little unbalanced. You're going to have to curate what you're going to be comfortable with at your table. That being said, I do think they are worth adding to your game as they provide interesting adjustments to the standard classes and give generally reasonable benefits with a little bit of a hindrance aside. So before we had the complications that go along with edges and feats and all of that stuff, we had kits. Kits would give you a small benefit and it might cost you a small hindrance, and they worked really well. As a matter of fact, they worked so well that TSR thought to include them in many of their Dragon magazine articles, one of my favorites, converting over the extra classes from Oriental Adventures that didn't make it into the handbook series. That said, these are ones that you're going to want to pick and choose. You want a buffet, not the whole mess. And number 4, I have the setting boxes. Now, true, some of these aren't a full world, but every one of these is enough that you could build an entire campaign out of it. You had the crazy Play a Dragon set with Council of Worms. You had the weird mutated savage coast of Mystara with Red Steel. You had the spacefaring adventures with Spelljammer. You have the resurrection of Gary's own Greyhawk campaign. You had Maztica far to the west of Faerun and all of its Mesoamerican influence. You had the ruins of Myth Draenor with the various Beta Zoo and Tanari, wink wink, that had taken over the former glorious Elven realm. You had Ruins of Undermountain and also Ruins of Undermountain 2 and several other boxes for that. You had a continuation of the dominance of Forgotten Realms. You had Al-Qadim with the Land of Fate. You had the Horde, which handled the area between Karatur and Faerun. And then you had one of my favorites, Tales of the Lance with Dragonlance. You also had Dark Sun and Planescape and Ravenloft. Oh my. Every one of these boxes was jam-packed full of maps, character options, monsters, campaign ideas, histories, and details that a dungeon master can mine to this day, no matter what system they are using, but they were built for 2nd edition AD&D, and I think that is where they were at their peaks. Number 5, world building. I've already talked quite a bit about these brown books, and these had plenty of world building in them. You know, the Thieves' Handbook had rules on creating guilds. The Dwarves' Handbook had rules on mining. All of them had their own little niche, and they all had great ways to spice up your campaign in areas that are going to pay special homage to a specific type of character. But beyond these brown books, there were also a series of blue and green books. And while I don't have any here for samples, I'm going to put an overlay there. So the blue books were the DM's version of these complete handbooks, and they would provide world building information. The first being the arms and equipment. There was also a necromancer's guide, and there was a complete guide to castles, and there were several different options there for DMs. Beyond that, there were also the green books, which were the historical reference books. I remember distinctly that I had one for Vikings, and I had one for Charlemagne's Paladins, and I had one that was aimed at a piracy style of campaign. Within the pages of these various complete handbooks, both the players but mainly the Dungeon Master ones, you had so much information to mine for specific types of campaigns that were out of the normal realm of gameplay. And by using these, You make your game distinctive from the other tables, and I really dig them. I wish I had some more of those, and probably in the future I will. But those are my number 5 reason second edition was great. Number 6, Elmore and Easley. Okay, this is going to be where I may get some major pushback, as I know that a lot of you say that the art was a downgrade from first edition. I get it. First edition art was iconic. But for me, the beautiful full color artwork that exists in very specific pieces throughout the core books of second edition AD&D make it an upgrade for me. For example, this great Easley art of the Cavalier riding through the chasm. I guess in second edition, he's probably not a Cavalier unless he's using the Cavalier kit from the Fighter's Handbook. But you get this great art that, to me, that is D&D. This picture is D&D for me. But then, moreover, when you get into some of these great color works that you just didn't have in the earlier editions of the game, this is my favorite right here. This picture is called the Dragon Slayers, and that's why I used it for the thumbnail, because this is something I just didn't get from the first edition books. Now, there has been some rightful condemnation of some of the more clip art style artwork, but I think that's mainly due to the way the art was reproduced in the Black Series books, especially the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. They dropped some of the more iconic pieces of art, but like this is fantastic. I don't see how anybody could be unhappy with that. This picture of a gnome, I would not want to play a gnome, but that one I might. Maybe it's a dwarf. Looks like a gnome to me. This is the stuff that people have problems with, which is the blue Celtic knot art that you find, but it's really just filler. The main are like this swan may, and for these here, I mean, this is, to me, what AD&D art is at its best. And again, I know art is subjective. What I like, not everybody's going to like, but that is my number 6. Number 7, Interconnected Worlds. AD&D 2nd edition seemed to have a major focus on being able to mix your different worlds, because there are at least 3 different settings that focused on bringing characters from different worlds together. You had Ravenloft, where the mist could grab you from anywhere. You had Spelljammer, where you could sail around in your magical pirate ships in outer space. Now, I don't know about you, but you tell me it's a spaceship, I'm not too excited. You tell me I'm going to sail around the universe in one of these? Oh, you've got me now. That is a cool idea. Spelljammer had some fantastic additions with new races and new ways to depict old races. Ravenloft had its great set of Isles of Dread and expanding upon what Hickman and Weiss had created with their original Ravenloft adventure. Then you also had Planescape, which took the old Manual of the Planes and turned it into an entire campaign setting. But all of these different ways to bring characters from different worlds together made everything so much more usable, and it just added a level of excitement to players. I remember the first time that I was playing in a D&D campaign, and we found a bit of a Spelljammer helm. We never got a Spelljammer in that campaign. We never even left the planet, but just finding a little piece of one was enough to make it special, and I really enjoy that part of AD&D 2nd Edition. Number 8, Dungeon and Dragon. No, I didn't mispronounce that for a change. These are the magazines of the era. Now, true, these existed both before and after 2nd Edition, but during 2nd Edition, I felt like these had a plethora of useful additions to the game. They were constantly expanding on new settings, giving players ways to have campaigns that were not covered in the existing books, and expanding on old ideas, converting them for the new edition, with a special reference to this issue, number 189, where it completed the kits from the Oriental Adventures book that had not been done in the PHB series. Then, of course, you also had some really great adventures in Dungeon Magazine that would be specific to some of the new settings, allowing you to see what the designers of the game had in mind for these settings to cover when they created them. Within these pages, for $3.95, $4.95, you got a absolute ton of material that you could use at your table. Because it was a magazine, you could really think of it as very optional. You didn't have the pressure to include it as a DM that you did from the Player's Handbook Complete series, but nonetheless, a lot of this you wanted to include because it just had really neat information. I remember going to my local Walden Books and seeing a new issue of Dragon Magazine on the shelf and thinking, oh, I just wonder what ways this is going to expand the game that I play. Specifically, I remember the day I got that magazine and getting it home and reading it, and I spent a friend's entire birthday party reading this magazine in awe at the different ways that I was going to be able to create characters that I hadn't been able to play for several years at that point. Another great thing about these magazines, you can still find them at resellers online for relatively cheap prices. You can get most of these for less than $10. If you use a little Google Foo, you can find which ones are going to have content that you want for your game. And for that reason, my number 8 is Dungeon and Dragon. Number 9, a working bard. Now, while it is true that on page 117 of the original Gygax Player's Handbook, there was a bard class listed. However, you had to play several levels of fighter, then several levels of thief, then several levels of druid, and then become a bard after you had done all of that prior. And it just wasn't a practical class. If you know any old heads that actually used the bard from this book and legitimately got the scores needed and played the levels to get there, please tell me about it, because I've never heard of anyone using the bard from this book. On the other hand, the bard in here, while often derided and not always given the credit that it deserves, I think that they really did a nice job here. The bard has some of the abilities of a thief, a little bit of magic from the magic user, a pretty decent selection of weapons and armor that they can use, and they still get some of the iconic bard abilities that have grown to be just a trope of the class, with the ability to buff their party with their songs. The bard as a class is very workable in 2nd edition. Now, true, it loses some of the best parts of all of those different classes, but it makes up for it in its utility, in my opinion. It's a little bit limited, only being able to be humans or half-elves. However, with the Complete Bard's Handbook, it expands it, at least in some form, to all of the main races, and I think that the Bard is a great addition to the game once you got past the version that was in this book. All right, my number 10, and if the art doesn't get me any heat, guaranteed this one will, because I think the number 10 thing that AD&D 2nd edition added to the game, which was great, was Thaco. Thaco gets such a bad rap, but when you compare it to its predecessors, it was revolutionary. You don't have to have these long matrices of different attack values to figure out whether you can hit a particular opponent or not. You just need to be able to add or subtract up to 10 from your Thaco score. You just subtract the AC value of who you're trying to hit from your Thaco score. If the AC is a negative and a negative makes a positive, so you would add it. So if I wanted to hit a negative 3 AC and my Thaco was a 17, well, I'd have to roll a 20 because I would have to add that to my Thaco because it was a negative and a negative. If I needed to hit a 2 AC and my Thaco was a 12, I'd have to roll a 10 because I subtract the 2 from my 12 Thaco. Thaco very much kept everything within the realm of quick math for your average teenage player of the game. It made things faster. It made the character sheet cleaner because you don't have to take nearly as many notes for quick shortcuts for what you need to roll to hit what opponents. And it had a very predictable progression rate, so it was a little less wonky than the actuarial table style that Gary provided us in the first edition of the game. Love Gary, love his game, but I like Thaco. I think Thaco makes sense. And if you can't add or subtract 10 from your Thaco score, then you probably aren't playing D&D anyways. So this was my number 10 reason that AD&D 2nd edition is great. Look at those absolute legends. Keith Simone, Dangar the Mighty, Jook, Blue Rose Lion, Agile Monk, Bjorn, I Am Not Tim, and Mike the Hammer. Special thanks to Pralinor, Acine Dean, and Steve Grodzicki. And there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. If you played it, what do you think about my takes? Are they right? Do you disagree with me? Tell me about it in the comments. If you haven't played it, have I convinced you to give it a try? If so, have you considered picking up some of the PDFs from DriveThruRPG? No, I am not an affiliate. I don't get anything from this. I'm just trying to share the game that I love with the world. Also, if you do give it a try, let me know about it. Tell me what you think after you give it a try. Lastly, if you want to hear more about AD&D 2nd edition, I've got 2 other videos out already on the subject, and I'm going to be doing another video next week telling you how to solo AD&D 2nd edition and going through that process with you so you'll be able to learn how the system works, how combat works. Basically, you're going to know how to play AD&D 2nd edition after you watch my video next week. So with that all out of the way, can't wait to see you next week. This has been Justin from Books, Bricks, and Boards. Good gaming, and God bless.